McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, welcome. I'm Dennis McCuistion, and I'm sitting here with my co-host, Jim Falk. Jim, welcome back to the program.
Always good to be with you.
We get to talk about a subject called fraud today. What do you think?
I think it's something that we have to look a lot into because, as we've talked about offset just a little while ago, it has continued to get worse.
Unfortunately, you're right about that. So let me ask you, does it seem to you as if there's always a headline where some government employee or some corporate executive has committed fraud? And in the case of corporations, the shareholders have paid the price with huge fines. Well, on this program, Jim and I will examine what causes individuals and their employees to engage in fraudulent behavior, and most importantly, what can be done about it. Now, joining us via Skype from Italy, of all places, is journalist Tom Mueller, who is the author of this book, Crisis of Conscience, Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. Tom, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dennis.
We'll be back to you in just a minute. I'm going to introduce someone you know very well here in the studio, and that's Marianne Jennings. And Marianne, you and I go back a long way, actually 17 years ago when you were first on our program. But for those people who don't remember you, you are Professor Emeritus of Legal and Ethical Studies at Arizona State University and the author of one of my favorite books called The 7 Signs of Ethical Collapse. So wonderful stuff. What exactly is fraud and why are we talking about it? How big a problem is it today, after all?
Well, if I could bring us down from the fraud, because you almost want to have organ music after people say fraud. We tend to want to think, okay, it's corporations, it's that, but each of us has some accountability, some responsibility for this, because when we say something that is not quite true, you know, I always say to my students, how many of you have said that you had to work to get out of going to a party because you didn't want to go? How many of you have said that you were late to work because of traffic and that wasn't true at all? So that I think what you have to do is start to look at sort of the little patterns, because there's nobody in government or business who wakes up one day and says, fraud, this is the way I'm going to be successful. It's a gradual thing, and we actually know from the studies that as the brain accepts more and more little deviations, you'll take on more and more.
Well, isn't that where we are in society today, though? We seem to be, not getting into politics at the moment, but we seem to be, shall we say, holding the truth in reserve in case we need it, or am I missing something there?
Well, yeah, and you have people saying, well, I'll speak my truth here. You know, there's one truth, right, and we really have to focus on that. I had a philosophy professor back in the 70s, and first course in philosophy, and he came to class with what we would call high water pants, flood pants, and so you could see his socks every day with sandals, so that you get the picture. Right. And he gave us a lecture on truth, and he said one day, there is absolute truth. We may not know all of the information at the time, but there is truth. And he said, for example, how many pairs of socks do you think I have? And it was brilliant because we all had an opinion. Well, there's the white pair, the argyle. We were debating back and forth, and we said, how many do you have? And he said, I don't even know that, because I would have to check the laundry, I would have to check the drawers, I would have to do all of that. And so he issued us a caution and said, don't ever say something is absolute or say it unequivocally until you absolutely know. So it's all of these little things that kind of help us learn the lessons. You know, there's a road to fraud. It's you know, not always paved, but there is a road to fraud.
And where we are today, it's so hard for people to agree on what is a true fact, what is the fact.
Yes, and that's because usually they don't have full information. And I think what you have to start realizing is that we're all sort of at different levels in this. And if you think about that, you'll realize some of the little things that you are doing that could make a difference. Mm-hmm. So I brought along a graphic.
Okay, good.
To show you.
Let's look at that graphic, which I think is graphic number 2. So we'll look at your shades of compliance. Out
Yes.
of that. There it is.
And
right
so
there.
what you have to think about is that some of us are into variable compliance, which means sometimes we comply with the rules and sometimes we don't. And a good example this year was at Sloan Kettering, a premier cancer research, and their rule is if you're doing work for a pharmaceutical or receiving money from a pharmaceutical, you've got to disclose that. You have to file a form so that we know it's a conflict, so that we know. And a lot of research was published that was funded, and they discovered that one of the researchers had only filed forms on about half of that. And then some of the research could not be replicated. They were not getting the same results. So as a result of that, he left, whether fired or we don't know that part of it. But the CEO came out and said, we have not followed the rules all of the time. And that's fraud. When you say you are following the rules and you have not, that constitutes fraud. And we even saw it in the Navy, where what we had was a lot of accidents, and when they did the root cause, they discovered that in the rush to get people through the pipeline, the education and the training, they would sign off saying this individual had done it, but they didn't. So it's close enough. We're going to go ahead and do it. And one time, you'll be okay, but if you get a group of people together who have not been through the experiences, it can be chaotic. So that's variable compliance. Now let's go to the next one, which is the amoral technicians, interpretive compliance. This is kind of my favorite crowd. They've been around for a long time. They know the rules, but they just sort of push the envelope so that, you know, for example, just recently in the news, we had parents deciding that they would sign over their kids in a guardianship because that meant they were financially destitute and they could qualify for more loans and other kinds of things for college, so they didn't have to pay. And they have to close that loophole to do that. And then you have examples such as, I was reading the history of Britain in India. And when they got to New Delhi, there were cobras everywhere, just all over the place. And the government said, well, we can't have that. So they decided to offer a bounty for everybody who bought in dead cobras, that they would pay them to get rid of them. And it worked. They were bringing in cobras right and left, but what we found out is that they were breeding cobras. That's the money return. So that what you have here are people say, well, show me where that's wrong. I want to know where I've made a mistake. And these are, in the accounting frauds, these are the interpretations, so that they'll push the envelope as far as they can. So accounting fraud doesn't begin with, well, let's just lie about the numbers. It begins with, okay, let's change the depreciation formula. And was there really anything? Well, you know, then you start down a path.
Well, and you remember, obviously, WorldCom, they were basically capitalizing expenses, and that's how they looked like they were making money, and of course their assets were growing because they were capitalizing expenses.
Interpretive crowd. They have this magnificent ability to say, show me where this violates the law.
Right.
And then the next two categories I'll cover together.
Okay.
And they're people who comply with the laws and regulations. But there is a higher law, and that's where ethics comes in. And I'll share with you an example. I was teaching at another university, and a student came up to me, because I think sometimes they believe I have exceptions to not telling the truth, but I don't, but they just want to know anyway. And he had gotten a job at an office supply store, and you don't need to know which one. And he was told, you'll get this much per hour, but you need to sell 3 warranties on computers and printers per week, and you'll get bonuses based on that. And he said he felt really awful about that, because he said his manager told him, now target the elderly when you're doing this, selling the warranties, because they're vulnerable. They'll believe you. And I resented this because I are an elderly. And
I'm not. Yes, I understand. Yes.
I are an elderly.
Yes.
And so a little nervous about technology, can use it, but don't know. And so he would say to them, okay, look, you're just going to use it for FaceTime and Facebook. Don't worry about the warranty. And he said, you don't print that often. So he would say, don't worry it. Well, his manager heard him and said, what are you doing? You got to sell the warranties. And so he said, okay, this week you got to get 5 to make up for this. And he said, so here's how I've done it. I build up their trust on the computer and say, you know, you're only going to use it a little bit, so I wouldn't get the warranty for that. He said, but then when it comes to the printer, I swoop in and say, but on the printer, you need to get that. And he said, that's cheaper. So he said, so what do you think about that? And I looked at it and I said, okay, does it comply with the law? Yeah, he didn't break any law. But the next layer is could versus should. Mm-hmm. I know you could do that, but should you do that? Which leads us to the next layer, which is people who think at that level. Every decision is made on an ethical basis, so that when they're making decisions about acquiring a business, they want to know, well, what are we getting? Like Novartis, they bought a company with a new drug. That's the last one. Mm-hmm. They bought a drug company that had a magnificent drug for children. One shot, I mean, it was over $1 million, and it was a cure for life. But they didn't really look into the data. And so at this level, we're really thinking through the consequences on college admissions. You know, we had special admits. We were opening a door to all kinds of shenanigans for student athletes and others, so that we're thinking through far beyond could versus should. Is this the kind of life I want to live? Is this who we want to be? Neil Armstrong is a great example. He always said, I am not going to profit from being on the moon and selling stuff, because he said there were thousands of people who did that. Sure. And when he found out with autographs, he would always give autographs. He was very generous. When he found out that people were selling them, he cut it off, because he said, I don't want to profit from that. That's the life that goes from one end to, you know, oh, once in a while I'll comply, all the way up.
All the way up.
And you kind of have to look at yourself and say, where am I? You know, it's like the people in the high occupancy vehicle lane. You know, does a pregnant woman count as two? You know, those are interpretive kinds of things.
I'd love to go into this a bit more with Tom, because Tom, I enjoyed your book so much, and one of the areas that you talked about was why some things, when you're at your own home, you're talking to your family, you know right away that it's something you shouldn't do. It's fraudulent, it's wrong. But when you're with your company, you look at it a little bit differently. Pressure from the management, pressure to meet certain goals. How do you see this?
Absolutely. The natural tendency of the human being is to say, oh, in that situation, I would of course do the right thing. But when, as Marianne and many others have taught me, when you are put into a situation with a charged team, a very tight team, a charismatic leader, some incentives like bonuses for those who succeed and firings for those who fail, it's amazing what you can get people to do. It is distressing to see what you can get people to do. And you know, we are all the children of Stanley Milgram, and this is getting on for 60 years ago now, that he taught us that very good people from all walks of life put in the wrong set of circumstances will basically, they weren't actually doing it, but they believed they were torturing innocent people beyond their consciousness level. So I started my book writing about whistleblowers, and I ended it really writing about the conditions that make them unique, make them, as Marianne said, aspire to something higher than the law, or close the gap between the law and basic morality, which for most of us sitting at home is quite clear, but in the real world, and I hate that term, this is all the real world, in the real world, the gap has grown as big as the Grand Canyon between law and morality.
And we're going to talk a lot more next week about whistleblowing, but give us a sense really about how bonuses do drive people to take fraudulent acts, and perhaps you could talk a bit about Wells Fargo as an example.
Well, I think that's a perfect example of a situation that is just guaranteed to create bad behavior, even among good people. Time and again in my book, I wrote about situations in which good people end up doing bad things. The vast majority of bad behavior in the world is done by good people in bad situations. And the Wells Fargo situation is one where they simply said, look, you need to deliver this many new accounts, this many credit card signups, this many. Here's the limit. If you hit that limit, you're going to get a bonus, which produces a certain kind of behavior. If you don't, there's the door. And the carrot and stick is an incredibly powerful combination. It's the good cop, bad cop for human morality, and very few people are capable of standing up to that. And most people lose sight in the midst of this pressure and this excitement of closing the deal. They lose sight of what's right and wrong. That's the difference between sitting at home with your family or thinking about it in church and actually acting on it in your workplace.
All right, so when I get a ticket and have to pay a fine for going through a stop sign, I'm more careful about stop signs. And yet there have been enormous fines and penalties that have been paid by so many banks, and yet that doesn't seem to really deter them. Do they just see this as a cost of doing business?
Well, as a Texas prosecutor once told me, Tom, until we start fitting out folks with orange jumpsuits, we're not going to get anywhere. I think that accountability needs to be personal. It's not just I that think it. There need to be direct personal consequences for bad actions. If I can pass along billion-dollar fines to my shareholders and keep my beach house, I'm not going to change my behavior one bit. This is a transparent opportunity for corporations and the senior management in corporations to take a pass on responsible behavior.
Well, unfortunately, Tom, you're exactly right. Some of us remember the crisis, let's say 30 years ago, what we call the S&L crisis. We sent over 800 people to jail. In this last crisis, in 2008, 2009, we sent exactly 0 to jail. Now, there are some instances in which I know, and you wrote about one of them, which we'll talk about on another program, about the Citigroup thing. There are people there who actually should have been in jail, but they were, quote, too big to jail. In fact, there's a book out called Too Big to Jail. So we got the too big to jail, and then we've got a situation where sometimes the prosecutors looking for their next job at a law firm don't want to really prosecute people. But what is it that had gotten us on this path of charging the shareholders basically billions of dollars and letting these people go free to do it again?
I think that the legal settlement as an institution is an extremely corrosive and risky way to do justice. It stands in directly counter to what the founders thought about jury trials and justice. And right now, the settlement for many corporate fraudulent behavior, the settlement is the default position, both for the defense lawyers and for the Department of Justice. And when you can just simply write a check and everyone divides a piece and everyone gets to say they're the winner, when you have dueling announcements at the end of a settlement, you can buy your own right to disclaim any liability. We've got a broken system. That is not justice anymore. That's covering up.
Well, you're exactly right. In fact, we have some graphics here Marianne brought. So let's look at these graphics. Let's start with graphic that has this first group of companies in it. These are the companies since 2001 that have had, quote, ethical lapses. You want to hit a couple of highlights there, Marianne?
I do. I will tell you that when I started this in 2001, which is when we met, it was post-Enron, and I had 7 companies, 1 column, and now I have 5 slides, 4 columns. And where you see a space here and there, it's because I got tired of realigning them every day, so I just left a space so I could do it. If you see a number after it, like Boeing and BP3, that means 3 times they've been in the headlines for ethical issues and headlights. If there's a question mark like Citigroup, I've lost track of the number of times.
Let's look at that next slide.
As you keep going through, we'll do alphabetically, and you can see all industries are represented. And the funny thing is, with some of them, it's often for the same thing, over and over again. Keep going, and I want to get
It's almost who is not represented.
Yes, yes, and you will see, well, and I can turn the cannons on myself. Universities and colleges I've just put into a big group because I got tired of putting all of the things. Yes.
Interesting.
So you have all of those, and you can see everybody from the yoga clothes at Lululemon to Madoff. It's just pervasive. And I think that's an important point to follow on what Tom said, which is, I almost want to say, do these people not read the papers? Because what happens is the exact same patterns emerge in all of these companies. And I think there's something also about the driving force where there's ego, or I don't know what it is, but they look at this and say, yeah, but I'm different from those other folks. I'm not like those other folks at all, because it's amazing how we're going through it right now. I see the dot-com crisis repeating. There's a lot of Silicon Valley investors, and they're looking at them and say, the unicorns. I mean, what is this? It's the same thing. I said, did you not study this back at this time? And Michigan State, Ohio State, Penn State, it's the exact same scandal, and they don't seem to read about it. So it's that organizational factor that Tom talked about, but it's also this inability to understand that you are doing exactly the same thing.
Well, so while we want to believe that people will do the right thing, what can companies or management do to do a better job of deterring fraud? Is it the responsibility of auditors, a compliance office? What can you do?
I think that's too late. I think that, don't get me wrong, you'd be foolish not to have all that infrastructure.
And a company like Enron had this great visionary mission statement.
Oh,
Well,
yes.
There's 64-page employee handbook.
Yes,
on that.
magnificent. Wells Fargo, we used to study Wells Fargo for its compliance program because very few organizations had that kind of infrastructure and were as devoted to compliance as Wells Fargo. So in fairness to them, they had all of that. But what you have to realize is that this is human behavior, and it starts very small. Their first complaint about people and the new account services came in 2000. This story did not break until 2016. And in 2000, they had 63 complaints from employees that said, they're gaming the system. These are not real accounts. So that what happened there is ideally what should happen, which is you have individual employees who don't have to stand up and be national whistleblowers and on the cover of Time magazine as a person of the year. You have them saying, hey, wait a minute, this person has done this. And then you have to take action. And I think the sieve there, the thing that fell through with Wells Fargo was audit thought risk was taking care of it, risk thought compliance was taking care of it, and so it just continued to grow. I'm an interventionist at the lowest level, so that if an employee has asked another employee to clock in for them, that's when you have to start formulating the culture, because it's the culture that does this to people. Why do good and decent people go along with fraud? Because it seemed like I was doing my job.
But as Tom Mueller talks about in his book, people who often sound the alarm, they're transferred, they're fired,
Yes.
they're put into a dark room with no assignments. So, that makes it much more difficult to do.
Well,
Tom, you spent, I guess, about 7 or 8 years working on this book. After doing all this research, are things getting better or worse?
Well, I have to say that my instinct perhaps is guided by the fact that I've been immersing myself for longer than is good for a sane human being in bad behavior and what happens to people who try to straighten it out. But I have to say that to add on to something that Marianne said, I can't agree more with the fact that good behavior starts at the basic personal level. But I would venture to say that if shame isn't dead, it's deathly ill. And right now, people don't read the papers because they're not particularly worried about reputational risk. I mean, if you look at what the banks, I think recidivist fraud is a good way to describe those 5 magnificent slides that Marianne put up. You can take people who are pillars of the community who have been responsible. Alex Gorski is a perfect example for me, that CEO of Johnson & Johnson. He was the architect of the Risperidol marketing plan, which was a massive fraud scheme and very, very dangerous for patients as well. He was at Janssen while they were formulating their opioids marketing plan. He has a number of other serious cases of wrongdoing under his belt while at Johnson & Johnson. And he is, not only a hero at his own organization and being paid tens of millions of dollars a year, but also on the board of IBM. He's a member of a number of prestigious organizations. He's on the board of the Congressional Medal of Honor, the National Academy Foundation. He's on the Business Roundtable and the Business Council. We get pontification from him on how corporations should be more responsible and more ethical. We've lost sight of what it is to be ashamed of one's behavior at the same time that we've lost sight of what real accountability means at a personal level.
Well, you mentioned what he does. He's head of corporate governance for the Business Roundtable. So when those 181 CEOs in August came out and saying a new purpose of a corporation, he's head of corporate governance for that group. So I found that extremely interesting, to say the least. Now, we just have a minute or so left, and I want to get one thing in. Marianne, you were on a program in 2002 talking about Enron, and we were talking about Jeff Skilling, who's now out of jail, by the way. But Andy Fastow was the CFO. Jeff Skilling was the CEO. Andy Fastow went to jail for 7 years. We had him at the University of Texas at Dallas at the Institute for Excellence in Corporate Governance. And you've spoken there for us before. And so a few years ago, I asked him as the last question, I said, my friend Marianne Jennings nailed Enron as a rogue corporation before the stock analysts figured out what you guys were doing. And he said, really? And I said, yeah, and here's why. She said that it was your culture that was what got her attention. And I said, what do you think about that? And here's what he said. He said, Dennis, she was right, and I'm the one who created the culture. So when you nailed Enron because of the culture issue, you were right on target. And Tom, we thank you for joining us so much on this program. We'll see you on another program on whistleblowing. Jim, enjoyed being with you here.
Absolutely.
Marianne, always great to see you. And, thanks for joining us. And tune in for this follow-up program we're talking about on whistleblowing. That's a way that well-meaning employees can expose those who commit fraud. Check McCuistionTV.com, follow us on Twitter, and always remember that we talk about things that matter with people who really care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at NikkiMcCuistion.com. Visit our website at www.McCuistionTV.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McCuistionTV or download McCuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.